Welcome back, everyone. Michael here with Offshore Citizen. Today I want to discuss with you what I call the new flag theory. And it's based on this premise. A lot of people are probably familiar with this concept of flag theory, sometimes called five flag theory. And just really quickly, the premise of it is that you should plant different flags with different things around the world. And they would pay attention to, where are your bank accounts, where's your residency, where's your citizenship, where's your company, can't remember what the last one, maybe where's your property or your investments, something like that. And historically, they had this idea of kind of spreading out these flags, and there were some practical reasons for it. I would say it became less practical somewhere around 2015 to 2017. So, for example, from an asset protection standpoint, what we used to do is we would set up a structure that looks approximately like this. You would have a trust. The trust would have a bank account in some place different than where the trust was. Then you would have a holding company, which would be in a different place than either of those two. And it would have a bank account, which was in another country still. We'd need to have an operating company, which have a bank account in somewhere else. And so you basically have 6 jurisdictions there, which makes it really, really difficult to go and kind of pursue. The problem with this became that it started to become really hard to set up bank accounts in these other countries. And it started to become much more practical to say, okay, because I need high quality banking, not just banking, I need to pick places based on where I can get solid banking relationships, and this starts to adjust the whole theory, right? And in general, I would say that there was a certain part of the marketing around flag theory that involved, putting things in banana republics, which were generally not as high performing as, say, more stable jurisdictions. Now, the idea of diversifying between jurisdictions makes a ton of sense, right? It gives you optionality. It puts you in a situation where you have some degree of protection, and you have a degree of, along with that, you have access to other resources through diversification. So this being said, as I commented on, a bunch of this has changed, and so I'm going to kind of give a perspective on updating it with what I will call new flag theory, and we will discuss it in just a second. Before we do, if you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button, hit the all notification bell. Appreciate your support. If you like these videos, give it a thumbs up, share it with your friends, thank you. And if you would like help with paying the lowest legal amount of tax possible, doing legal offshore or international tax optimization, forming companies, opening bank accounts, asset protection, getting residencies in other countries, getting citizenships, please reach out to me. You can book a call, calendly.com/Michael-Rosmer. There's a link in the description below, or send a message through our websites, offshorecitizen.net and offshorecapitalist.com. Okay, so here's the idea. The idea is that in the modern age, it is quite important to consider more than simply these things that we were discussing before. So kind of I went through those, whatever it is, five flags or whatever. And it is also important to consider that there are practicalities around clustering some of these things, okay? So the things that I'm going to pay particular attention to today revolve around a comment from a longtime friend and client of mine who was making the comment that, you may save on taxes but may not be able to get a mortgage, and the opportunity cost of not having access to capital can actually cost you more than the tax savings that you're getting, which is an interesting perspective. You'd have to run the math on, how that works out, but you can sort of understand the basic premise. When you leave your country, depending on where you're from, it might be that it's really easy to say, get a mortgage where you are. Okay, perfect. Well, that access to capital can be useful. I was just having dinner with some friends last night, and they're quite involved in real estate, and they were talking about, about 12 to 14% rental yields, which is pretty good. And if you leverage that up a bunch, well, especially with low interest rates, even if you're paying 3% on that money or something, and say you leverage at a 70% LTV, you've got, you've just boosted your returns quite a lot. It's actually a pretty attractive return just in terms of the cash flow, never mind capital appreciation potential. So that's very interesting, right? Now, that's not an option for people in many different circumstances. So now I think we need to consider, all right, certainly where are you? And you probably need to diversify where you are. So in general, the advice that I would have is, let's start with the fact that, yes, of course, you should probably have multiple passports. I'll do some other videos in the future about specifically my view on what may happen with passports over the next while and what that has to do with, but it's probably a good idea to have a passport, a second passport, maybe multiple. It depends a little bit on which countries you're coming from, how much that affects you. Obviously, if you're coming from a country like Nigeria, where your passport is very poor, then there's just an obvious immediate benefit. If you're coming from someplace like, for example, Ireland, the obvious immediate benefit is minimal. And so, you can prioritize based on how much money you have available, really is probably the primary driver, and your circumstances, what you should look at in terms of multiple passports. But multiple passports is probably a good thing. The thing that was less talked about until fairly recently, over the last couple of years, was multiple residencies. And this really has to do with your ability to get in and out of countries and have access to those places. So to the extent that you can have residency permits in other countries, this is pretty attractive. So, some places allow you to maintain a residency permit with spending minimal or no time there. Sometimes this means you may have to make an investment there, and that has some trade-offs. Obviously, you're tying up some capital, there's some opportunity cost, et cetera. But nevertheless, not a bad idea. So I would say, in general, looking at if you can get multiple residencies is a good thing. And if you can get permanent residencies in particular, that's especially useful. Okay, so that's stage number 2. Beyond this, we start to think about what is going to be our tax consequences, right? So obviously, if we have a bunch of residencies, we can potentially pick and choose which one is our home base from a tax standpoint. Now, what I would say is that if you want to optimize your life, then you probably don't just want to be mobile between places. Okay, so you probably also want to actually live somewhere, and this is going to determine, your quality of life really matters, right? So one of the most basic conversations I have with people very, very often when they book calls, et cetera, when we're working together is, okay, on the one hand, you have tax savings, right? And there's a mathematical equation you can run. And I can tell you that, okay, in your situation, the best option is to move to this country and have a company here, and that'll get you as close to zero tax as possible. But that's a relatively minimal part of the overall discussion, because what if you don't like living there? That doesn't make any sense, right? So what we want to actually do is say, okay, let's optimize our life, and optimizing our life is going to have a large part to do with where do we want to live? Who are the people we want to be surrounded by? What environment do we want to be in? What do we want the weather to be like? Where can we get a home that we're happy with? Et cetera, right? And so in that sense, if you're going to have some diversity between multiple places, I think it makes a lot of sense to set up multiple homes. Again, some people I was talking to the other day were talking about they're based in Dubai for part of the year, and they're like, well, we don't want to be in Dubai for the summer, so where do we go? We're kind of nomadic. And I was like, honestly, I think it helps to have multiple homes in that case, whether a home means rented or owned. The point is, you don't have to feel like you're living out of a suitcase for 4 months, hiding away, running from something. You can go from one place you're comfortable to another place you're comfortable. Much, much better quality of life. So this is sort of an optimal scenario. Now, this comes into some of the parts that I think get a little bit overlooked, which is in the modern day, credit and relationship with banks, et cetera, is really important. As much as I hate banks, probably nobody hates banks more than me. I'm very frustrated by banks. I would love to, I think that they're terrible. This being said, the reality in the modern world is that banks have perhaps never been more important, right? It used to be you could transact in cash really easily. If you're doing international things, you really can't. On top of that, if you try to go to a bank with a bunch of cash, they're going to hate you. So you have this double negative. So you kind of need to optimize for banking, right? This is just the reality of life. And the moment you start optimizing for banking, you need to be looking at a few different things. You need to be looking at the type of assets you have, where those assets are, where you live, your income, the type of income you have, okay? All these things are important. Why? Well, it's much harder to get a bank account in a country that you don't have residency. So if you have a home and residency and banking in the same place, banking there is usually fairly easy. It's generally not a big deal. If you're not resident there, don't have a home there, and want to get a bank account there, it's become pretty hard. And yeah, there's some cases where you can, and there's private banking, and so sometimes the wealth management services are more flexible and all this. But realistically, that's not going to be optimal for most people in most situations. So What I think you need to look at is you need to look at it from the standpoint of, okay, where can I show income? By showing that income, I can also have a residency permit. I can probably have a home. I can certainly an address, right, that's permanent. And I can be in a situation where I can build history with the bank, which allows me to also get credit. Because credit is just a powerful asset, right? So everything from, all right, you may be able to get a points card that gives you, much better rewards. Let's use a simple example. There's a card that you can get 7.5% in Dubai at any of the Amar properties. So 7.5% cash back is a big discount, right? If you're spending a reasonable amount of money. So, the person who buys and doesn't get it versus the one who does, the one who gets it is better off, right? But then you have the opportunity to purchase properties, which might mean you have a home that you like a lot more, right? Or it could mean you have investments that perform a lot better. One way or another, this is a good asset for you. And so you don't want to be dependent on any one place that you're going to build credit. So ideally, you should be thinking from the standpoint of, okay, where can I build up credit? And what are the things that they're going to need? And based on what those things are that they're going to need, how do I orchestrate the other parts of my life? So for example, in some cases, receiving a dividend is perfectly acceptable. In other places, receiving a foreign salary is acceptable. In other cases, it needs to be a local salary. And so you can kind of plan around that. And that's a really, really important part of the equation. Now, of course, what goes along with this is then where are your assets and where are your businesses, trusts, whatever kind of legal structure you have behind you. I would say that those parts, the structuring part, the businesses and trusts, is very utilitarian. So it should not be the aim. Like the aim is never, hey, listen, I want to have trusts in somewhere or businesses in somewhere. They serve a purpose. And if they don't serve that purpose, just get rid of them or don't have them or whatever. Obviously, being able to make the investments that are going to be the best investments for you at any given time, that is important, right? And so designing around these things and then utilizing the tools that are available to achieve this. It used to be that we would look at it and we would say, there's trusts, there's companies, there's bank accounts, and these are your tools. It turns out that bank accounts aren't really so much your tools anymore. They're like your bread and butter. You need them to survive, unfortunately. Whereas companies and trusts don't need to be. They're just something to optimize all the other stuff. And you're going to use them or not as needed. So I guess the main thing that I want to emphasize here is you should be focused a lot less today on spreading things out and a lot more on finding places that you can be more concentrated. More concentrated setups are more robust setups, they're more durable, they offer a lot more value. I think what we've learned over time is that the risks, a lot of the risks are more in your head than they are in reality. And oftentimes by trying to flee from a certain risk, you actually create a new risk. So for example, if you had gone and said, okay, I want to have another flag in another country, which means I'm going to go open a bank account somewhere else, and I chose to put that bank account in, let's just use Argentina as an example, right? Say this was 20 years ago or something. Well, that would have been a really bad idea. That was a bad flag that you planted because it actually made your situation worse rather than better. The objective should never be to plant flags per se, right? The idea should be to make your life better, and by making your life better, or one of the tools for making your life better is to use this concept of planting flags. And so I think focusing heavily on concentration of things in an area that makes those things more stable. So you pick places that are good, right? Places that have good long-term value, solid investments. You say, okay, doing this in such a way that I'm going to have stability, I'm going to have flexibility, I can have accommodation around it, and I build these concentrated bases, I think is really the way that it should be done today. And as part of that, which seems never to have been really talked about in flag theory, you should consider not just aggressive relationship with the bank, but all of the stuff in terms of how you do income, how you do assets, etc., and how that factors into credit, because frankly, it just makes a really big difference. So anyway, I hope that helps. I hope it's an interesting idea for you. If you have questions, put them in the comments below. I would love to hear your ideas. If you think I'm off base, say so. If you have something to add, please, we'd love to hear it. And I'm going to look forward to seeing you on the next video.